One rainy afternoon, Peppa was exploring the dusty attic of her house while Mummy and Daddy Pig were busy downstairs. She had never been allowed up there before, but today the door was mysteriously left open. Among the old boxes and forgotten toys, she discovered something that made her gasp with wonder. An ornate mirror with a golden frame, covered in strange symbols that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The mirror was much taller than Peppa, with an elaborate frame decorated with carved roses and thorny vines. As she wiped away the dust with her sleeve, her reflection appeared crystal clear. But something was different. The Peppa in the mirror seemed to move just a fraction of a second after the real Peppa moved, as if she was copying rather than reflecting. Curious, Peppa waved at her reflection. The mirror Peppa waved back, but her smile seemed wider, more knowing. George came up to the attic, drawn by the sound of Peppa's footsteps above. He saw his sister standing transfixed before the strange mirror and toddled over to join her. But when George looked into the mirror, his reflection was nowhere to be seen. The mirror showed only Peppa, standing alone, while the real George stood right beside her. "George, why aren't you in the mirror?" Peppa asked. But George just stared with wide, confused eyes. The mirror Peppa turned her head toward where George should have been and smiled, as if she could see something that the real Peppa couldn't. Then Mirror Peppa began to mouth words, but no sound came through the glass. Peppa leaned closer to try to read her reflection's lips. The Mirror Peppa was saying something urgent, pointing behind the real Peppa with increasing desperation. But when Peppa turned around, there was nothing there except George, who was now backing away from the mirror with a frightened expression. When Peppa looked back at the mirror, her reflection was gone. The mirror showed only the attic behind her, the boxes, the dusty floorboards, even George cowering in the corner. But no Peppa. She waved her arms frantically, jumped up and down, even pressed her face against the glass, but the mirror refused to show her reflection. George started crying and ran toward the attic stairs, but when he reached them, they were gone. The attic had changed. The walls seemed to stretch higher, the shadows grew deeper, and the only light came from the mirror itself. Peppa grabbed George's hand and tried to run, but every direction she turned led back to the mirror. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, Daddy Pig's voice boomed from downstairs. "Peppa, George, come down for lunch." The sound of his voice broke the spell. The attic returned to normal, the stairs reappeared, and the mirror became just an ordinary reflection again, showing Peppa and George exactly as they were. But as they hurried down the stairs, Peppa glanced back one last time. In the mirror, she saw her normal reflection waving goodbye. But behind her reflection, barely visible in the shadows, something seemed to be waiting patiently, as if it knew that Peppa would return to the attic someday. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa found a strange music box in her bedroom that wasn't there before. The music box was painted in bright Peppa Pig colors, but something felt wrong about it. When she opened it, a tiny dancer began spinning inside, and it looked exactly like Peppa, but with joints that bent in impossible ways and a smile that was painted too wide. The music box played a haunting lullaby that seemed familiar, yet twisted. The tiny dancer inside had glassy eyes that never blinked and moved in jerky, unnatural motions. As the music played, the dancer sang in a voice that sounded like Peppa's own. "Dance with me, play with me, never let me go." Peppa tried to close the music box, but it wouldn't shut. The music grew louder, and the tiny dancer began to grow bigger with each spin. Soon, the dancer was the same size as Peppa, standing right in her bedroom, still moving with those strange mechanical movements. The music box. Peppa had the same pink skin and red dress, but her smile was painted on and never changed. Her eyes were made of glass and reflected the light in an eerie way. She spoke in that same sing-song voice. "I've been waiting so long for a friend to dance with me forever." Mummy Pig called from downstairs, but when Peppa tried to answer, the music box. Peppa mimicked her voice perfectly. Soon, Mummy Pig was talking to the wrong Peppa, unable to tell the difference. The real Peppa watched in horror as her mechanical double lived her life. The music box. Peppa never stopped smiling, never stopped moving in that jerky, wind-up toy manner. She would tilt her head at odd angles, and her arms would move like a marionette's. At night, she would stand perfectly still in the corner of Peppa's room, that painted smile glowing in the darkness. Every day, the music box. Peppa tried to convince the real Peppa to step inside the music box. "It's so much fun in here," she would say, her voice echoing strangely. "We can dance together forever and ever. The music never stops and we never have to grow up." The music box itself began to change, growing larger each day. Inside, Peppa could see a miniature world that looked like her house. But everything was slightly wrong. The colors were too bright, the angles were too sharp, and tiny mechanical versions of her family moved around like clockwork dolls. As days passed, Peppa noticed that the music box Peppa was becoming more lifelike, while she herself felt more mechanical. Her movements became stiffer, her smile felt painted on, and she could hear the faint sound of music box melody in her head. The music box. Peppa would whisper to her at night. "Soon we'll switch places completely. You'll be the one in the box, and I'll be the real Peppa. Won't that be wonderful? We can take turns being real and being the toy." Peppa realized that the music box was a trap, designed to capture children and turn them into mechanical dancers. The music box Peppa had once been a real child too, trapped inside this cursed toy for who knows how long, desperate for someone to take her place. In the final confrontation, Peppa had to choose between stepping into the music box to save her family from the mechanical imposter, or finding another way to break the curse. The music box. Peppa's painted smile never wavered as she extended her stiff, doll-like hand. The music grew louder and more hypnotic, and Peppa could feel herself being drawn toward the music box. The tiny world inside looked so perfect, so safe, where nothing ever changed, and the music played forever. But she knew that once she stepped inside, she would become just another mechanical dancer, trapped for eternity. As the music box. Peppa's glass eyes reflected the moonlight. She spoke one final time. "Don't you want to dance forever, Peppa? In here, we never have to worry about growing up, getting hurt, or being alone. We can be best friends forever and ever." The music box began to glow with an otherworldly light, and Peppa had to make her choice. Would she sacrifice herself to save her family, or could she find a way to break the curse and free the music box Peppa from her eternal dance? Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was the longest day of summer when Peppa and George noticed something strange happening with their shadows. During their afternoon playtime in the garden, Peppa realized that her shadow was moving differently than she was. While she would wave her right hand, her shadow would wave its left hand. When she jumped forward, her shadow would jump backward. At first, she thought it was just a funny trick of the sunlight filtering through the trees. But as the day progressed and the sun began to set, something much more frightening began to happen. Peppa's shadow started moving completely independently, even when Peppa herself was standing perfectly still. The shadow Peppa would dance and gesture while the real Peppa watched in growing alarm. George noticed it too, pointing excitedly at first, but then hiding behind Peppa when he saw how the shadow Peppa's movements became more and more erratic and unnatural. The shadow Peppa was exactly the same shape and size as the real Peppa, but it seemed to be made of pure darkness that was somehow deeper and more solid than any normal shadow should be. When clouds passed over the sun, normal shadows would fade and become lighter, but the shadow Peppa remained just as dark and defined as ever. It was as if this shadow existed independently of any light source, drawing its darkness from somewhere else entirely. As evening approached and the family gathered for dinner, the shadow Peppa began appearing on walls inside the house, even in rooms where there was no direct sunlight to cast shadows. She would slide across the walls like a living piece of darkness, always staying just at the edge of everyone's vision. When the adults looked directly at where the shadow had been, they would see nothing. But Peppa and George could always see her clearly, watching them with what seemed like hollow, empty eye sockets. The most disturbing thing about the shadow Peppa was that she seemed to know things that the real Peppa was thinking before Peppa herself had fully formed the thoughts. When Peppa was about to reach for her favorite toy, the shadow Peppa would already be reaching for it on the wall. When Peppa was about to speak, the shadow's mouth would already be moving silently, as if speaking the words first. During bedtime, when Mummy Pig turned off the lights, the shadow Peppa became even more active. She would move freely around the walls and ceiling of the bedroom, sometimes appearing to be walking upside down or sideways, defying all the normal rules of how shadows should behave. The darkness of the room seemed to make her stronger and more solid, as if she was feeding on the absence of light. George began having nightmares where the shadow Peppa would try to pull him into the walls, reaching out with arms made of pure darkness that felt cold and empty to the touch. In these dreams, the shadow world was exactly like their real world. But everything was backwards and wrong. The sun was black, the grass was gray, and all the colors had been drained away, leaving only different shades of darkness. The shadow Peppa seemed to be trying to communicate something important, but her silent movements and gestures were impossible to understand. She would point urgently at different parts of the room, trace shapes in the air with her dark fingers, and sometimes appear to be writing backwards letters that spelled out words no one could read. On the third night, the shadow Peppa began to grow larger and more three-dimensional, as if she was trying to step out.
It was a rainy afternoon when Peppa discovered something strange in her grandmother's old mirror. The reflection didn't quite match her movements, and there was something unsettling about the eyes staring back at her. As she leaned closer to examine the antique glass, she noticed her reflection was smiling, even though she wasn't. The mirror began to ripple like water, and suddenly Peppa felt herself being pulled into another world. A world where everything was backwards, where shadows moved on their own, and where her family had become something far more sinister. In this twisted reflection of her home, the walls were covered in strange symbols that seemed to writhe and move when she wasn't looking directly at them. George was there, but his innocent laughter had been replaced by an eerie, mechanical giggle that echoed through the dark corridors. Mummy Pig stood in the kitchen, but her back was turned and she wouldn't respond when Peppa called her name. When she finally turned around, her face was stitched together with green thread, and her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. Daddy Pig sat in his chair reading a newspaper, but the words on the pages were moving and rearranging themselves into threatening messages. The house itself seemed alive, breathing and pulsing with a malevolent energy that made Peppa's skin crawl. She tried to find her way back to the mirror, but every door she opened led to another twisted version of a familiar room. The playroom was filled with toys that moved on their own, their painted smiles now looking menacing in the dim green light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. As Peppa ran through the house, she could hear footsteps following her, but whenever she turned around, there was nothing there except shadows that seemed to dance just out of sight. The mirror world was a trap, and she was beginning to realize that her reflection hadn't just been different, it had been trying to warn her. Now she was trapped in a place where nightmares were real, where her loving family had become creatures of darkness, and where the only way out was to confront the truth about what the mirror really was. It wasn't just showing her another world, it was showing her what her world would become if she couldn't find her way back before the transformation became permanent. The clock on the wall ticked backwards, counting down to something terrible, and Peppa knew she was running out of time to escape this nightmare reflection of her life.